It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative peer Gavin Barwell, Labour MP Chris Bryant, editor of Labour List Sienna Rogers and Danielle Boxall from the Taxpayers Alliance. Today, Boris Johnson says this about climate change.
It's time for humanity to grow up.
There are big problems waiting for him back in the UK.
Government, I repeat, will not be bailing out failed energy companies.
Keir Starmer sets out what he calls the road ahead, all 14,000 words of it. Not everyone in the party is a fan.
It looks like the Sermon on the Mount written by a focus group, to be honest.
Who can fill Angela Merkel's shoes?
After the war, we all felt a little bit like orphans. And she gave us a feeling of security.
And my guest Gavin Barwell was Chief of Staff to Theresa May. Why did it end like this?
I will shortly leave the job that it has been the honour of my life to hold.
You heard Boris Johnson there in the headlines. He also said about the climate change challenge that this is a turning point for humanity. But that isn't the dominant issue at home. Let's have a look at a couple of the headlines in the newspapers. In the Daily Mail, Britain faces winter of woe. Millions to be hit by £400 fuel bills shock. And The Mirror has this headline. We'll all pay the price. The energy crisis deepens. I'm just going to start with Gavin and Chris and ask the question, what is the biggest challenge, Gavin, for the Prime Minister? His diplomacy at the United Nations that we heard, or how he responds to the gas crisis here at home?
I think it's a really good illustration of politics, the long term versus the short term. So long term, climate change is the defining issue for our generation, and what happens at this conference in November is going to be crucial. But short term, I think the government's got some real challenges on cost of living. I think if you look at the energy bills, the tax increases coming in, the universal credit reduction, that's going to be a big issue in our politics over the next few months.
Chris?
Well, Gavin was sort of pointing over to me as if to say, and now Chris will ram this home. Yes, I mean, I completely agree. Look, climate change is undoubtedly the defining issue of our generation. And I think, I mean, I'm pleased that Boris Johnson is finally seeming at least to take it seriously, though his speech yesterday was remarkably childish, I thought, all that stuff about Kermit. And sometimes I just feel if he could only dedicate himself with seriousness and use all the energy that is good in him, but with serious endeavour, then he would achieve far more. But I think the government's fallen asleep at the wheel in relation to all the cost of living increase issues that there are. You know, inflation, food prices going up, the cut in universal credit, which government ministers' excuses for now are wearing very thin, I think. In my own constituency, it's going to mean £6 million coming out of the local economy. That's going to mean fewer people shopping and shops having a more difficult time, and that's and all the knock-on effects. If they don't get this right, I think this will be the defining issue for this government, is that people will feel less secure and have less financial security. And just to explain to our viewers, you may probably know that Boris Johnson referred to Kermit the Frog in his speech in the US because he was saying it is easy to be green. Kermit the Frog was wrong. Sienna, do you think this is a challenge for Boris Johnson on the one hand, but an opportunity for Labour when it comes to cost of living? We heard Angela Merkel yesterday in the Commons raising those issues at Prime Minister's questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think Angela Merkel, the deputy leader who's standing in for Keir Starmer, I mean, she certainly delivered a very energetic performance, and there was tons for her to go on. You know, she did one of the more kind of scattergun approaches to PMQs, just because there's so much to hit the government on. So, you know, people are facing higher energy prices, the increase in national insurance, there's the end of the £20 uplift to universal credit, you know, which lots of people have said it's just completely unjustifiable, especially at this moment. And it does all link to the climate crisis stuff. There's like the more long-term stuff, although it's really not actually that long-term at all. But really, Labour kind of needs to be talking about, and is talking about, a just transition. That's what's missing from the government's offer here. There's no evidence that it's not going to be forcing the poorest in our country to really actually bear the brunt of the cost of fixing the climate crisis to whatever extent that is actually possible, but kind of holding back the worst effects of it in this country.
I mean, Danielle, there's pressure on the government and on the business secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, for sustained bailouts to keep companies afloat. Wouldn't that be a sensible option?
Well, I don't think it would be a sensible option, because if the companies do get a bailout, it gives them no incentive to, when the next global gas crisis comes along, to actually fix something in time. So they just expect another bailout. So I think the government is right to sort of suspend this idea of bailouts for these companies.
So you wouldn't want to see any further action?
No, I think consumers will be protected by the fact that there are companies that have managed to stay afloat, and they do seem to be shifted over to other tariffs in other companies. So I don't think the bailouts will be needed necessary to sort of protect the entire sector from collapsing. I think that, you know, we need to ensure that these companies don't just rely on government for bailouts every time that there is a slight difficulty. We need to encourage them to invest more in their storage capacities, for example, to make sure this doesn't happen again in the future.
All right, let's move on to Labour and a story about Keir Starmer discussing a proposal to change how Labour leaders are elected. This is how Labour list. Sienna has covered it. Starmer set to take suggestions on rule changes ahead of the conference. The party conference is starting at the weekend. Is he actually going to press ahead with these changes? They're obviously controversial for certain people within the party. Has he got enough support?
That's the question. So it sounds at the moment as if he is going to press ahead with these changes. The thing is, yesterday was supposed to be kind of the pivotal moment in this. He met with general secretaries of trade unions, and he asked them, I mean, it is quite last minute, just days before conference, he asked them, you know, basically, what do you think of these rule changes that I really want to put forward in a few days' time? Are you going to back them? And the reception was frosty. They have really kind of, apart from kind of Unite and the left unions having concerns about the switch to an electoral college generally just on the basis of democracy and those sort of arguments, all the unions have concerns about how much it will cost them to ballot millions of political levy payers, how it will actually work in light of the Trade Union Act. It's gotten a lot more complicated, and they want to think about the costs and the practicalities, and they're suggesting, well, can we leave this until after conference and maybe do a special conference on it later? That's how the switch to one member, one vote was done by Ed Miliband in 2014. It took months and months of preparation, but it seems as if Keir Starmer does just want to press ahead. He really wants to use this conference to get through these internal rule changes, because he feels as if he's only got 3 opportunities, right, until before the next election. He's got this conference, he's got next year's conference, and then the general election campaign. So that's why they want to push through all this internal stuff now. Right. I mean, Chris, not an ideal start to the conference?
Well, I don't know what the plan is. I've not been privy to any of the meetings. What I know from my own constituency in the Rhondda is that whilst it felt like a really good idea to enable anybody to come in and pay £3 and be able to vote for the leadership of the Labour Party, it ended up with so many wrangles, because we had people who had always said previously that they were going to vote Plaid in every general election, suddenly choosing the leader of the Labour Party.
But the timing, was it wise ahead of a conference to push this through?
Yes, I think it is. And I think, the last thing I want is years and years and years of wrangling about rules of the Labour Party. And so I think sometimes you do actually have to be decisive as a leader. You have to say, right, this is what I want to do. This is what I think is in the best interests of the party, and in the end, in the best interests of the nation, because, as Keir says in the pamphlet that he's produced, he doesn't accept, and I don't accept either, this idea that you're either in favour of principles or you're in favour of power. The whole point is you try to put your principles into practice through gaining power.
And, of course, we heard a different view from Richard Bergen, your colleague within the parliamentary party. You mentioned the pamphlet. Let's show it to everybody. It's called The Road Ahead, Keir Starmer MP. It's a 14,000-word essay where he sets out what he stands for, because he has been criticised, hasn't he, by people like Angela Merkel, the Deputy Deputy Leader or the former General Secretary of Unite, Len McCluskey, for not being clear about what he stands for as they see it?
The task for every leader is to lay out a clear vision. And, of course, that's been difficult during the period of COVID because the world has only really been interested in COVID. Every single email, and they've been thousands coming into my office, is all about COVID. So I think it is good that he's laid this out. And I have to say, I really enjoyed it. I think it's...
Bestseller?
Well, none of my books have ever been a bestseller, so I'm not... And incidentally, my books are a great deal longer than 14,000 words. No, you're not meant to sort of do that slightly sneery face.
No, as if I would. I'm laughing along with you. Sienna, is this going to do it, this 14,000-word essay?
Well, you know, as you mentioned, people in the Labour Party often accuse him of having no politics. And this is kind of a response to that. And the point is, obviously, nobody expects, you know, the general member of the public to be reading a, 11,500-word pamphlet published by the Fabian Society. They're not going to hear about it. But the point is to get people like us talking about it today, and we are. So it's effective in that sense, because we're talking about who Keir Starmer is, how he wants to change the Labour Party. It's getting a conversation going before conference, and that is the...
Let's test that theory. Are you reading, or have you started reading it, Gavin?
I've read the 10 principles. And it seemed to me to be kind of emblematic of Keir. You know, I think he's a decent person, but I agreed with 8 of them, and I nearly agreed with the other 2.
Oh, are you in the wrong party?
Well, so no, I think
He's
it
been
shows.
in the wrong party for a long time.
I think it shows that they're sufficient. They're bland. They don't tell you what kind of prime minister he would actually be, and that's the problem. Leader of the opposition is a really difficult job, but what you have to do is actually give people an impression about how you would be different. And it struck me that those 10 principles didn't do that. Virtually anyone in British politics today would agree with them.
I disagree for 2 reasons. There are 2 things that shone out from me. The first was the analysis of the problems that we've got in the country, and one of those, and a primary one for him, being about security, by which I don't mean national security and the threat from the Russians or whatever, though that's something that he's done a lot of work on when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, but more that sense of, I don't know how my career is going to go in life. I don't know whether I'm going to be doing 40 hours next week or 10 hours next week. I don't know how I'm going to put the food on the table for the kids. I don't know what career decisions I should be making. And a fascinating point about if 30 years ago a builder, a bricklayer, would earn enough to be able to buy his own home. That is not true today. No chance. So that sense of security, I think, was a really different kind of attitude towards Labour. But still, the old things about, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, in a sense, the old-time religion is still very much part of it.
Danielle, are you going to read it? Have you started reading it?
Yes, I have read it, and there are definitely some really positive and interesting things that Keir mentions in there. I mean, he talks about wanting low-paid workers to keep more money in their pockets, which is a breath of fresh air, I think. It's compared to what we're experiencing at the moment with the Johnson government and the increase in national insurance and the income tax freeze. So that's a very positive sign. And also his comments on waste were very welcome as well. I mean, he's been fighting PPE waste all throughout the pandemic, and it seems like this idea of waste seems to be a sort of core idea that he wants to take through to the future as we move out of the pandemic. So I think taxpayers will be quite pleased with some of the things that are mentioned in there. But I do think what's worrying is the fact that the main sort of topic of conversation going into the conference is this electoral college system. I mean, this is so far removed from what taxpayers and the electorate want to be talking about at the moment. It just seems like a very internal sort of political discussion that's removed from the actual politics of what's going on in the world around us.
Right.
I don't think it will be what we're talking about by Monday, by the way.
Right, OK. But just to refer back to what Danielle was saying at the beginning of her answer, do you think Keir Starmer will welcome support from the Taxpayers Alliance?
I always welcome support. I mean, I'm never quite sure about who the Taxpayers Alliance really is, because they never publish who they're funded by, and which always seems a very dodgy way of engaging in British politics. But anyway, leaving that to one side, yes, of course, I think we need to reach out to voters who didn't vote for us last time. Look, it's pretty basic, isn't it? We did terribly in the last general election. We've got to get ourselves back in good order, because apart from anything else, the country needs a good opposition. There's one other bit that I really liked. He differentiates himself by being serious. And I know some people will sneer at a 14,000-word essay and all the rest of it. But actually, some of the issues that we have to deal with in modern politics need seriousness. not Boris Johnson.
All right, just briefly, Danielle, did you want to respond to what Chris said about the Taxpayers Alliance?
Yeah, of course, Chris. I mean, there are lots of political groups that don't publish their funding. We're just one of them. But if any member that does donate to us wants to independently say that they are...
no, you should publish all the names of everybody who funds
All right,
it.
let her finish.
Some people don't want their public political opinions broadcast publicly.
Oh,
and that's fair enough. And I respect their privacy.
All right, we're going to move on because there are hugely important elections in Germany this weekend. It marks the end of the Angela Merkel era. Let's talk to our Europe editor, Katja Adler. She's been on a road trip around Germany and is now in Berlin. Hello to you, Katja. Set out for us the significance of this election. I mean, how big a moment is this for Germany?
Hello. This is a huge moment for Germany, as you can see. The winds of change are definitely blowing. But how many countries in Europe do you know that has the same Prime Minister, in this case the Chancellor, for 16 years? So, for example, when it's the youngsters in Germany and some of the first-time voters, she's the only Prime Minister that they've ever known, Angela Merkel. So this necessarily will mean change in this election. But it's not just Germany, and particularly people are saying Angela Merkel was a great crisis manager when it came to the financial crisis, the migration crisis, and more or less in COVID. But she's being accused of not being a visionary for Germany, not preparing it for the future, environmental change and many other issues. But it's not just for Germany, it's the EU that's also very interested in these elections and further afield. Of course, Germany is the richest and most influential country in the EU, and that makes it significant, not just in Brussels, but also for Beijing and for the UK. Bilateral relations are so much more important now that we've left the EU, and also Washington.
Katja, there's a big delay on the line, but we'll press ahead. What will the EU look like after Angela Merkel? I mean, is there going to be a bigger role for France at a time when President Macron sees the EU doing more on things like defence, for example, and being less reliant on the transatlantic alliance?
The reason I smile is because if you say, does France want a bigger role? Absolutely, France wants a bigger role. If you remember, when President Macron became president, he was also known as Mr. Europe. He had this massive reform programme idea for monetary union, for reform there, and also to make Europe have a bigger role on the world stage in defence and so on. And of course, we know that France is very upset about the new security deal between the UK, the US and Australia, for example. But Germany's always been a bit more reticent. I think, Germany got a shock when Donald Trump came to the White House. For the first time, all of Europe just thought, oh, we can't rely on the US anymore just to immediately have our backs in security issues, but other issues as well. But it doesn't take the same stance as France. As for Emmanuel Macron, yes, he's waiting in the wings, but don't forget, he stands for re-election in April, so he's not guaranteed to stay in his position, and he, as of January at least, he's going to have to turn inwards and really think about domestic affairs and really beat that presidential campaign trail. So I think, considering, as I said earlier, Germany is the wealthiest nation in the EU, it carries a lot of weight. It has more of a position between the countries east and west, also inside the European Union. So in Brussels, people will tell you, whatever France says, nothing will go. There will be no changes without Germany's say-so. And just a warning, it could take quite a lot longer than Sunday to find out what Germany's next government is going to look like. It looks like it's going to have to be a coalition of maybe 3 parties, and that kind of horse trading can take quite a while.
Katja, thank you very much. That was some delay to Berlin. Katja mentioned the Security Alliance. Let's take a look at the headline in the Daily Telegraph. Johnson and Biden astonished at Macron. PM tells French President to get a grip over his reaction to Australia, UK, US pact. And he also mentioned it in a speech yesterday, in an interview, I should say, yesterday. Let's have a listen.
I just think it's time for some of our dearest friends around the world to, prenez un grip about all this, and donnez-moi un break, because this is fundamentally a great step forward for global security.
Gavin, were you surprised by the French reaction to this security alliance, AUKUS?
Not particularly. I think if we If the tables had been turned, we would have probably been pretty offended ourselves. I think that what we've done in terms of strengthening Australia's security capacity is a good thing. I think the way in which it was handled, the lack of consultation with other allies, was a mistake. And you got, to be honest, I think privately that's now admitted. If you look at the readout from President Biden's conversation with Macron, he basically acknowledged that, and there's clearly been a real effort underway to mend bridges.
What about you, Chris? Were you surprised by the level of outrage? Some of the things that were actually said by French ministers. We know, accusing the UK of being a bit player. We know their constant opportunism. They're an interloper.
I think this whole year we've seen a series of misplays by the British government on Afghanistan. And now on this new alliance. Yes, of course, we have a strong interest in what goes on in the South Pacific. We need to make sure that China doesn't feel that it owns the whole of the Pacific. But the idea that you would forget that France has a significant interest there, it just beggars belief. And it makes me very angry. And then when he does this, cod French, I just think he's not a serious person. And it worries me, because when it's about national security issues, I think these mistakes cost lives. And I'm still really angry about the withdrawal from Kabul. I have constituents who ring up in tears every single day to my office because they know of translators, interpreters who worked with us, who are still there and are terrified for their lives.
Right. Well, let me get the others' reaction. Danielle, first of all, in terms of the way the French have reacted to this security alliance, how did you see it?
Well, I don't think we should be too surprised. I mean, given the fact, as Kasia mentioned, there is a French election coming up. I mean, this is a big opportunity for Macron to sort of display his prowess on the world stage. But I do agree that there was a lack of communication between the British and US sides and the French. And there have been reports that France only found out through about the story as it broke in the news. So I think they should have perhaps been a bit pre-warned about it before the news actually broke. But as I say, I don't think we should be surprised by sort of Macron's posturing on this. I mean, obviously he wants to do well in the election, and who can blame him? But yeah, I think most people will sort of roll their eyes at Boris Johnson's response and say, OK, well, I think what we need to be focusing on are the issues at home rather than sort of these sort of petty disputes abroad.
But it's an important relationship, Gavin. Before I come to you, Sienna, more broadly, it's an important relationship, the Anglo-French one. How will it change, if at all, once Angela Merkel has gone?
The Anglo-French relationship? I don't think Merkel's departure necessarily affects the bilateral relationship. Look, I think with Macron, there's always been a tension. I saw this at first hand. He is an Anglophile. He wants a closer Anglo-French security relationship, but he was one of the most difficult people over Brexit.
Right.
And he's never really been able to see that the way he behaves on this issue affects people's attitudes to the former. So in the Sahel, at the moment, we are cooperating. It's a French-led operation, but UK is making a contribution to that. And I think he will want to deepen and broaden that cooperation. But clearly, what we've got at the moment is the rows over Brexit have polluted what would otherwise be, I think, quite a close bilateral relationship. And that's what we're going to have to put right. And I hear the points Chris has made. It wasn't just the British government; it was the Australian government and the US president as well. There's a collective.
Yes, but I think we sit closest to France, sure. and the British-French relationship is the Entente Cordiale. It has been a really important part of our security understanding, and there are so many issues on the world stage where we have to align ourselves closely with France, whether it's dealing with Russia or China, lots of other places as well.
I do think there's one very briefly interesting point, which is that the new coalition in Germany that we're going to get afterwards could shift German policy towards Russia and China, and that's quite interesting. One of the reasons Biden has done this is because the EU wasn't fully going along with where America wanted to be vis-a-vis China. So it'll be interesting to see.
And our not being at the table is a problem in that.
Well, let me bring in Sienna. I mean, just on the back of this security alliance and the French response to it, how easy will it be to maintain good relations, Anglo-French relations?
Well, I mean, I think we've seen quite a few different incidents this year where Emmanuel Macron, he is not scared of really harsh criticisms, and sometimes unfairly, sometimes in quite a damaging way. I mean, we saw that during, the vaccines. It seemed as if there was a bit of a weird, misplaced jealousy going on, and he started, criticising our vaccine rollout that could have been quite damaging here. And then in this case, it kind of seems like it was really more justified that there was a communication failure. But I think going back to, what Chris was touching on there, is that really for Labour, I think this is one of the key ways in which Keir Starmer differentiates himself from Boris Johnson, that he's a very serious person. His slogan, kind of one of the things that came out of this pamphlet, is work hard and play by the rules. And he's very much a rule follower, whereas Boris Johnson isn't. And he was talking about this communication failure about the deal in terms of, what it's like when you try and sort of hinting at, when you try and break up with someone, you leave it to the last minute. It's just such a sort of childish approach to the whole thing. And he doesn't seem to be taking any of it seriously. So, it also relates to German elections. If the SPD win, that's obviously very good for Keir Starmer. If he were to become Prime Minister, he'd have a real ally there in the Chancellorship.
Gavin?
I think it will slightly change the balance of centre-right, centre-left in Europe if it's an SPD-led German government. I wouldn't overstate that. I think one of the things that's really interesting about this German election is the way in which the SPD candidate has styled himself as Merkel's successor. He's used the female form of the word chancellor on his election leaflets. He's even copying the Merkel diamond hand gesture that she uses. So this is really a battle for continuity between the two centre-left.
But interesting for Keir, I think, is that it's about security.
All right.
In that sense of a secure future for yourself. And I think voters will like that from Keir.
Yes, you've definitely read that pamphlet. I'm impressed.
I've read that pamphlet.
Right, let's just show everybody. Let's just show everybody this headline in the Times. School children hold mock trial of Tory MP Richard Drax over ancestral slavery links. Now, this relates to a campaign charity set up and led by the human rights lawyer Clive Stafford Smith. They've been staging mock trials in schools. Future ones will prosecute Nigel Farage over Brexit. It will prosecute Nick Clegg over tuition fees, Tony Blair for Iraq, and Priti Patel on the UK's immigration policy. We have Clive Stafford Smith, I think, with us now. Clive, are you saying that Brexit was a crime and that you are going to prosecute Nigel Farage as a perpetrator?
No, of course not. What we're talking about is an educational process. The charity I've set up is an educational one. And the idea is to help really fabulous teachers provide experiences to young people who can then learn about all sorts of things that what I would refer to as my generation, a slightly decrepit one today, I will say, what we've been doing that has a very big impact on their world. And, one hopes that from this, the young people going to learn a whole lot of things about history.
Right, but take us through it. How would it work then? You're going to put Nigel Farage, for example, on trial for Brexit.
Well, I know Nigel Farage, and, he's one of the few people, I think, who will have the courage to show up at a trial like this, and I'll certainly invite him, and defend what he did. And, what we just did in the Drax trial, for example, is there were prosecutors and defence lawyers. So there were 3 young people prosecuting, 3 young people defending, and then a bunch of people who were all young sitting as jurors. And the idea was that they would put together a case theory memo that was all sides of these questions. And then the issue would be presented as one would with a real trial. Obviously, no one's going to prison or anything. No. But with any luck, it's going to educate people and get these young kids. They were fabulous.
Right. But I think the interesting point about this is the prism through which you've set up these cases or the trial. So just to stick with Brexit, you're saying it's wrong and you're blaming Nigel Farage for it. It was wrong. Otherwise, what's the trial about?
No, these are things that the kids have come up with, right? They're issues that the kids are interested in. And so they're exploring those things. Now, clearly, you can't have a trial without someone, whether it's a civil or criminal trial, without someone being alleged to have done something wrong. But the issue is then whether you hear both sides, you discuss the whole thing, and then you make up your own mind.
Right. So
if
a student came to you and suggested putting the lawyer Gina Miller, for example, on trial for perhaps trying to subvert the will of the people, as some might see it, would you do it that way?
Why not? I mean, they might put me on trial for representing a bunch of people in Guantanamo Bay who American government said were terrorists. I have no problem with that. I think it's really, really good for us to explore these things. And part of my defense would be that all my guys were tortured, and I want people to know about that.
Right.
So, there can be anything.
OK, I mean, would it be better, perhaps with school children, to concentrate on the issues rather than putting individuals on trial in that sense?
Do you know what? I think it's always best to focus all discussions through a lens of individuals. Right. Because, this isn't just some sort of academic debate. It's something that people have chosen to do. And they're really, really interesting issues that young people very often don't know who did them. Very few young people know that it was the Labour Party who were the ones who introduced student loans. Now, they normally blame it on the Tories. I think it's kind of important that we should have that debate.
Right, or on the Liberal Democrats, I think, and that promise. Danielle, what do you make of this? Is this a good idea?
Well, I do think it's fantastic that we're getting children involved in debating and public speaking. And I think, it's part of a healthy democracy that we discuss political issues like these. But I do wonder whether this is just taking it a step too far. I mean, I'd much rather see children just debating the issues at hand and perhaps learning about the people involved in it rather than putting one particular person on trial and sort of putting it all on one person or one individual for the entire of a political movement, for example. So I do think it is a good thing. And perhaps, we used to do mock trials when I was at university and I studied history, and we did a mock trial of Thomas More, which was fantastic because he actually was put on trial and found guilty and executed. But we did a sort of mock retrial of that. So that was a fantastic way to learn about the subject. So I would like to see this used in perhaps other instances in lessons. Yeah, definitely.
Sienna, your response? Does this look like politicisation?
Everything is political. You can't avoid that. I think it sounds really interesting. I mean, I went to French school, so we never did anything that was participatory. We never got out of our chairs. We never really discussed things. That's just not the kind of education that I received. But I think, encouraging young people to be critical of establishment figures is always a good thing. And I think, as Danielle said, it sounds like the kind of thing you'd see at a university rather than a school or at a private school. So those kind of, soft skills, the values of debating societies, that sort of thing, gives young people confidence as well, and those sort of different skills.
Gavin, what's your response to what you've heard from Clive?
So I think that exposing young people to these issues is really good. I'm not sure about the personalisation. I generally don't like the whole way in which in history we sort of say Winston Churchill won the Second World War. Millions of people contributed to that. And likewise, Nigel Farage on his own didn't deliver Brexit in this country. 17 million people, voted for it. So I'm not sure personalising it around individuals I necessarily agree with, but discussing these issues, absolutely.
What about, Chris, Tony Blair on Iraq?
I'm relaxed about it. I think being able to marshal an argument, being able to express yourself, these are all really important parts of education. And I think it's good that Gavin is right in the sense. If you just look at Winston Churchill, for instance, villain or hero, a bit of both is the truth, and it's true of nearly everybody. And the very fact that by definition that in a trial there are two sides of the argument, I think is an important in relation to Tony Blair and Iraq as well.
Right.
I supported the war in Iraq, and I don't resile from that. But I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing for children to debate in school.
Clive, you're listening to this, I hope, and still there. Just looking at the subjects or the trials that you are going to pursue, do you accept that you are presenting them and looking at them through a particular prism and viewpoint?
No, I really don't. I think it's very much both sides. And honestly, what I would love, because what we need to do to support our teachers is to help them do things that they don't have the money and resources for. And the charity I'm running is exactly designed to do that. But there are lots of great people out there who could come and debate them. Chris, may I just issue a personal invitation for you to come and be a witness in the Iraq war?
I knew that was coming. I'm a fool, aren't I?
I love a bit of on-screen negotiation. Yes.
Yeah, no, I'll come.
But incidentally, just on nothing, Chris.
If we're virtually doing, if we're just talking about Iraq, one of the things I think we as a generation of politicians have to think about is if you look at our intervention or non-intervention in several different countries, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, where did we get it right and where did we not get it right? I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned, so I'd be happy to take part.
All right, well, there,
Which would
Clive.
be wonderful, and I really appreciate that.
All right, well, you've got an
Great
acceptance there. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to talk about Gavin's book, the substance of it. It's about his time, obviously, with Theresa May. It's called Chief of Staff. Andrew Rawsley in The Observer called it an insightful memoir steeped in Brexit, backstops and backstabbing. Gavin, I'm just going to remind you of what Theresa May, not that you need reminding, promised in her Lancaster House speech in 2017, that she was negotiating not for partial membership of the European Union, associate membership of the European Union, or anything that leaves us half in, half out. But she failed. Was that the failure of her premiership, that it was actually down to her inability to deliver what she promised in that speech?
No, I think that the failure was the inability to deliver the votes in Parliament to deliver the deal she negotiated. She always was clear that she was looking for a compromise. Now, people differ over what that compromise should have been, but she was in Parliament at that time. There were a group of people that wanted a second referendum as a way of checking the question, and there were people that wanted the kind of hard Brexit that we've had now, and she wanted something in between.
Right, were there too many red lines there?
I think what I say in the book is that I think that in the period before the negotiations began, the government could have done a better job setting out what the choices were. So I think some of the debates about red lines is a little bit off-putting, right? The main red line was not staying in the single market. Her view was that a deal where we stayed in the customs union and the single market was not in any way leaving the EU, and I think she's right about that.
Right, but as you say, she failed, you say you failed. Was she the wrong person? Could someone else have delivered it?
Well, I think we saw afterwards how difficult it was to deliver it, but Boris Johnson ultimately had to have an election and change the parliamentary arithmetic in order to deliver it. So I think if Theresa was sitting here, she would probably say to you her biggest mistake was the campaign she ran in 2017, because she saw that you needed to change the numbers in Parliament to be able to get it through. And then because of that campaign, she wasn't able to do that. So it was very difficult in that Parliament. It was a very painful period. I think with the parliamentary arithmetic as it is, it was very difficult to get anything through. Parliament itself held loads of votes and never actually came up with a single option that MPs
No,
had.
sure, but in a way, what she set out in that Lancaster House speech, was it just too rigid? She couldn't deliver it. Yes, for some of the reasons that you set out, but it wasn't really deliverable, and that brought down her premiership.
So I don't agree with that analysis. I think if you look at the deal she negotiated, it was consistent with Lancaster House. It wasn't negotiating the deal that was the problem. The problem was then getting the MPs to vote for it.
Chris?
Well, she needed me to vote for it, really. I'm the kind of
Are you culpable
person,
here?
and I would have been... I'm culpable, yes. I'm for everything. I mean, I was the kind of person who was willing to talk.
You were.
And I had lots and lots of secret meetings with people in... not in Downing Street, but other government ministers and so on. And the problem always, for people like me, was the red lines that had been set right at the beginning. In particular... I think if we'd been able to say that we were going to be in a single market, effectively going back to, as it were, the version that Mrs Thatcher wanted originally of the European Union, or our membership of it, I think a large chunk of us would have found it very difficult to have voted that down. But that was ruled out from the very beginning, and that made it, very difficult.
So, look, I campaigned for Remain, so I understand the arguments why people wanted to stay in the single market. But I think a world in which you were in the customs union, in the single market, presumably you'd have been in some kind of security arrangement as well, and a fishing arrangement you'd have needed for the customs union. What would actually have changed for the people that voted for leave if you were in all of those things still? It's very hard to me, even as someone who campaigned for Remain, to see how that was ever going to be an acceptable compromise.
I was chairing a group which we called the Buses and Trains Discussion Group, because we didn't want anybody looking over our shoulders to see on our phones who we were talking to. And I just think that there was a much better version of Brexit on offer, or available, if Theresa May had had the kind of the personal strength to be able to reach out. And I think she was a terrible Prime Minister. Very closed. It was like it was the wrong person at that particular moment. I now really like her because she's done one thing which I wish every Prime Minister did in our system, which is stay in Parliament, take part in the debates, provide your wisdom from the backbenches. I think that, and it's not just because she's always criticising Boris Johnson. But Boris delivered a botched Brexit. Every single week we see new reasons why the version of Brexit that we've ended up with it was a mistake.
Right. Well, you might want to respond to being a terrible Prime Minister, but and then I want to ask you about too many Remainers around her.
So look, I'm obviously biased, and I wouldn't have worked for her and spent 2 years of my life if I didn't think she had many of the qualities that I want to see in a Prime Minister. I think the question for Chris and others like him is we would both agree, we've ended up with a worse version of Brexit than the one she presented. And we all have to take, Theresa, me, but also those who didn't back her deal have to take some responsibility for that outcome.
Right. Jo Swinson is the one in the end. Jo Swinson is the one who believed that she was going to form a government and pulled the plug on what could have been a much better version of Brexit.
All right, well, Danielle, let's look at it from the other side, if you like, and the sort of deal that Chris would have liked to have seen wouldn't have been acceptable, would it, to Brexiteers and many people who voted leave?
Yeah, well, I think Theresa May, she did a very honourable thing, which is that she tried to seek a compromise, but perhaps there were too many, red lines that we mentioned set out at the beginning. So whenever something was reneged on or whenever something was sort of stepped back on, perhaps it sort of it annoyed the wrong people, I think, and perhaps that too many people got on the wrong side of her. But I do think she did try to achieve a compromise that suited all sides. But unfortunately, there were too many egos, I think, in Parliament to get that through.
Egos in Parliament? Politicians? Surely not.
Sienna, you're a broadcaster. No egos in broadcasting.
But I didn't have a vote in this. Sienna, can we just talk about Keir Starmer? Do you think he bears some responsibility for what turned out in the way that Chris sees it, for torpedoing May's deal when the government did eventually reach out to Labour?
To some extent, I do, yes. I think I actually part opinion with most of the Labour Party, Labour MPs, Labour members, certainly Keir Starmer. In my personal view of what happened there with Brexit, I thought that, at the time on Labour List, I actually published someone from within government, a government official, talking about how the kind of Labour, Tory Brexit talks were going and how it was a big missed opportunity because, as we've seen, we've now ended up with a worse Brexit. And I think, the irony of the whole situation is just very sad. I think it was ridiculous that Boris Johnson then came in and passed what was originally rejected and what Theresa May was being criticised for. And I do think it was a missed opportunity. I think Labour should have engaged in those talks with, more good faith, actually.
Right, Chris?
I think we did engage in good faith, but the thing is, the Labour Party, like the Tory Party, was five or six different beasts.
Did they engage in good faith? You've written about the role of Keir Starmer.
No, I think they did engage in good faith. I think the issue was Keir was speaking for a group of Labour MPs who wanted a second referendum in any deal. Putting aside my own personal views, if Labour had voted with the government on the third vote, when it was just about the withdrawal agreement that Labour agreed with, the bill would have come forward, Parliament would have decided on a second referendum on a customs union, but Labour would have been in a much better position vis-à-vis the Johnson government. It would not have been able to be accused, as it was at the 2019 election, of having blocked Brexit. So he is, to a degree, the author of the position that the Labour Party finds itself in now.
I don't think that the Jeremy Corbyn party had a single view in Parliament. Nor did the Conservative Party either. But what all of this process... keep on hitting that. What all of this process has exposed to me is how the British electoral system is really bad at dealing with hung parliaments. And actually, I predict that we will have more hung parliaments.
All right. Well, on that prediction, let's talk about Theresa May now and what she's going to do or how she's going to respond on the backbenches. We've seen it, obviously, already with things like international aid.
So I agree with Chris. I think it's really good that she's chosen to stay in the House of Commons. And I think it would be great if more senior ministers did that. I think they have a valuable contribution to make. And she's picking up on issues that she feels strongly about and contributing to debate on, in the right place.
And long term?
Well, I'm not her spokesman anymore. It'll be for her to decide what she wants to do. But I hope, as long as she's still got a passion... And one of the things I would say about her to anyone that doesn't know her well, she really has a huge passion for being the MP for Maidenhead.
All right.
And she gets great fulfilment out of that job. And what we've focused on Brexit, but I hope what the book does is give an insight into her, the person, and what goes on behind that family.
I'm going to say thank you to all of my guests, and we'll be broadcasting live, of course, on Monday from the Labour Party conference.